Hey, not sure if we're actually live yet or not, but maybe we are. Yeah, it kind of looks
I
like we
believe
are.
we are live.
I tend to always try to check the socials real quick to make sure. And like, oh, yeah, there we are on LinkedIn. I hate looking at myself, talking about myself, looking at myself while I'm talking about myself.
Just assume you're always live, and then there won't be any kind of, oh man, I shouldn't have said that on the air
I
moments.
know, I know. So, hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm doing great, Tim. How about you? Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's a Wednesday, getting ready for ChannelCon next week. Pretty excited. Matt, Lee, and I and Sheldon are doing a little policy documentation workshop. And then,
Nice.
pretty excited to see people again. It's been a hot minute since MSP Geek Con. Got to remember the con part. Yeah, so, it's conference season, right? So,
It is. It's that time of year. I think
yeah,
the
yeah.
whole year is conference season
Yeah.
right now. It's kind of shifted that way.
Yeah, there's been some interesting posts on Reddit on slash RMSP, which you would know because you're a moderator over there. But it's what conference do you go to and why? It's been interesting to see some of that feedback. But we're not here to talk
Yeah.
about conferences. We're not here to talk about conferences today. So
We are here to talk about vendor vetting and
whoa.
vendor due diligence. But vendor vetting sounds way cooler as a title. So that's why we went with the alliteration style title.
Yeah, yeah.
This start we've discussed this on LinkedIn a few times and in Slack
Mhm.
and all over the place. And I said, let's go in and have this discussion publicly. Let's just talk
Sure,
about it for the world to see and
sure.
reference. So there's a couple things that we're not doing any prepared questions. There's no script. We're just doing it live. And the two things we're going to try and cover are um, some of the aspects and some of the things to think about and things that you might currently not be thinking about when it comes to vendor
Mm,
due diligence. And the other thing is we want to have a discussion about what this looks like from the vendor side as well. That's not talked about quite as often.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll put my MSP hat on for a minute and kind of put that kind of back in the back burner and talk about like what does this look like from an MSP perspective, right? And
Yes.
I've all of us we've talked, as a community about this stuff for, a really long time, trying to come up with, how does this work for an MSP? How do we pick and choose vendors? How do we deal with all of this? And so, one of the things that our MSP did was several years ago is basically built a process on, you know, how to deal with stuff. Doesn't matter whether I'm looking for a new ERP system for a client or I'm looking for a new, EDR tool for us or whatever. Like it boiled down to like really building out a process that helps us get the answers that we're looking for. And I think that's the question we're probably going to dig a little deeper into, right?
What are you looking for? And in fact, having an answer to that question is step one. Just like with
Mm-hmm.
CIS, know what you have with when it comes to third party management, know what
Yeah.
you're looking for, what you're trying to do, and have it written down somewhere.
Yeah, that was always the first part of our process. Like, what business problem are we trying to solve? Not what requirements, not what bells and whistles, not what features yet. What business problem are we trying to solve? I'll give you an example. So one of our clients uses a survey tool that they've monkeyed around with for years to do surveys, and they've had it. They've been extremely trained and well versed and use it all day, every day, and they love it. Um, but they recently instituted a policy that you were not allowed to survey anyone under the age of 16 without a parent present. Well, this being an educational company, like all they do is minors. And
Right.
so the business problem in this case we were trying to solve for was we're not allowed to use our favorite tool anymore. Okay. There could be other cases of what business problem we're trying to solve is, we do a risk analysis or an assessment or something and find an inefficiency in the business, right? A manual process, something that like just our biggest pain point, and we want to try to solve for the biggest pain point. So for us as an MSP, working with our clients, like at that like consulting level on, what business problem are we trying to solve? I can't tell you how many times a day, a week, a month, a minute. Hey, we would just want to, go buy the latest widget.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a super good point in that you hear vendor due diligence and you hear the title vendor vetting, and you kind of jump to, or at least I do, jump immediately to, I've already picked someone, help me figure out if they meet my security requirements, my compliance requirements. And there's a lot that goes into it before that. And we can even talk about having a formal methodology for making those decisions as opposed to, who took us out to the nicest dinner from all the sales reps.
Yeah, that is the norm in the industry, right? Which is, oh my gosh, I found a widget and I've been sold on that widget because it's going to do these widgety things. All right, are you even like, where does it fit in the business? Like, is it even a problem in the business, or did you just get
Right.
shiny object syndrome?
Right. So what do you do for that? I can talk a little bit about what I do, and that is I will tend to, before even picking anything, write a requirements list, just like I was doing software. And
Exactly.
depending on how much time I have, I will try and weight those with relative factors so that, because no one's going to hit all of them, right? So I have
Mhm.
this list of, you know, 10 things, 5 of them are
Mhm.
absolute must-haves, some are nice
Yep.
to haves, and it turns into an Excel spreadsheet almost every time with
It
some
is
formula to calculate them. Is that what you
exactly
guys do?
It is exactly what we do. We started with identifying a business problem, whether it's a staff member or the business, whoever is coming to us with shiny object syndrome. The first thing that we do is identify, is there a business case? Period. Right, and we can kind of do that through some Q&A. We can kind of do that with our client through some discovery to determine, is it really a business case, or is it just a nice to have, or whatever. And 9 times out of 10 it's shiny object syndrome, but that 10th time, like in this case with the survey tool, yes, there was a business case. And so
Right.
once we determine there is a business case, the very next thing we do is we assign a champion. Who is the point person? Doesn't have to be a technical person, doesn't even have to be a user of the tool or whatever. It needs to be somebody to make sure things are on time, on track, and are flowing appropriately. Usually for us, it might be one of my technicians, or it might be, a single point of contact at the organization, but identifying those humans first. Once we have that in place, then we get into the requirements list, the must haves, the nice to haves, and the, oh, would it be cool ifs? Right.
So
And
when you do this, are you putting information security requirements or certifications on this list, or is that part of a vetting process after the function
both,
part?
both, right? Both. So I'll pick on the survey thing, because it's just the example that I'm running with here, right? So we know we need skip logic. We know we need this kind of stuff, but we also know we're collecting sensitive data. So we need to account, where are they storing? How do they process? Who act, like all the security and compliance pieces around the sensitive data. So absolutely in the requirements, I'm having 8 or 10 or 20 or 40, whatever requirements to make sure that whatever vendor we're choosing will, try to meet those requirements. And some of those are must have, nice to have, and can't live without, right?
Right. Right.
We could do the same exercise for, picking a CRM, picking a SIM tool, picking a EDR tool, hell, even picking what laptop to buy and standardize on, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. For
Doesn't
anything.
matter whether it's software. You could do the same process with hardware.
Makes sense. So you would include you would count something like being able to handle sensitive require information, functional
Yep.
requirement. And
Yep.
then maybe things that are common to every vendor, like let's say you need to have SSO support, or let's say you need to have a particular framework, you would put that right on the
Absolutely.
spreadsheet as part of your normal process. What else do you do? Do you call support during it? Do you try to engage with the community? Are there things outside of technical functional requirements you do? I like calling support. I try and come up with an
Yeah.
obscure ticket to see how that goes.
So it depends, right? As anybody in this space will say. Um, you know, a lot of the we've seen a lot of the software vendors, a lot of the tools, like in order to access their support, you need to be a client. So that's kind of out, right? I'm not about to give up all of our information to get stuck into a sales pipeline to ask questions. I'm going to do my own sort of diligence and vetting. I'm going to look at things like G2. I'm going to look at their website. I'm going to spend as much time on the privacy pieces while the
Mhm.
product champion, the human that I, put in charge is going to work with the functional requirements. I'm going to take an hour or so and go look at the security stuff that they publicly talk about on their website. Some vendors do that really well, but a vast majority of them don't do it at all. They have the required one or two GDPR privacy statements or whatever, and that's about all they do. So, trying to find that, that information on how are they dealing with this can be challenging.
And specifically, we're talking about not just the regulatory audit seal of approval on the website, right? If you get your SOC 2 or if you get your ISO, you likely have the icon somewhere, but really
Yeah.
more concrete information about how things are done, what
Yeah.
policies are in place. Not the policies themselves, right? That'll be under NDA most likely, but some information on how to get started or anything beyond just the
Exactly.
icon.
Both Microsoft and AWS, and even Google for that matter, have done a really good job about publishing that information. But when we get all the way down to the small vendors, right? Even maybe even the ConnectWises or us for that matter, like a vast majority of them in the MSP space don't do a good enough job. There are some that do a really great job. Our friends at CyberFox, for example, they have a whole trust center. Like I have a whole trust center and I keep fleshing it out
Yeah.
and redesigning it and add like, yeah, but there are some vendors that take this stuff seriously. I worked, I'll give you a little anecdote. I don't know how many years, two anyways. I was looking at a tool well known in the space, Lifecycle Insights. Alex is a good friend of ours, great community leader, Alex and Marnie. And I was thinking, like, I want to use this. It would be a great tool. And I started asking Alex and Marnie about, like, what are you doing to protect data? How are you doing? Like the questions.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you want to pull up my form, but I literally sent my form to Alex and,
Let's do
and
it.
was like, you want to pop that up? I literally sent my form to Alex as we, kind of progressed in the conversation on, hey, we have a vendor due diligence program. We have a form. We'd like to know about what it is that you're doing. And I kind of call this now, back then it was a little different, but now I kind of call this my scare away the vendor form because it does. Like, I don't know,
It's a lot.
I think there's 68 or 78 questions. I haven't even counted on here, right? And you can get this on our website, Valtech Services, to kind of give you a baseline jumping off point. You can stop sharing, kind of give you a jumping off point. But I gave that to Alex, and he's like, "What?" And in his defense, like I just blew him out of the water because I mean, I hate to say I got my shit together, but I know what I'm doing when I'm vetting stuff and wanting to protect stuff. And so it actually opened up a much bigger conversation between Alex and I around this topic of vendor vetting. Now, you ask Lifecycle, they will give you what they have. They have a really great program. They're doing all the good things, all the right things. And, on the vendor side, not saying Alex or anybody for that matter, but on the vendor side, like, I'm not going to spend 3 hours going through this form for $100 thing. Like, I'm just not.
Yep.
Like, it's not worth my investment. right?
Yeah.
And that was, and that was one of the points that, we kind of hammered a lot on was, you know, what can we do as vendors to show the community, to show the prospects that we're doing the right things and not spending hours and hours and hours on a form that, Tim has that is ginormous for $100 deal.
It's so true. We were talking pre-show, and I used to get these at Gradient all the time, and
Mhm.
every single one started with, "How big of an opportunity is this potentially, and is it worth me spending an entire day filling this out?" That's just the
Yeah.
reality of it, right?
Yeah.
It's a big time commitment on the vendor side, and you know it and I'm split because the security engineer side of me is like, this is great, all this stuff, I'm glad they're asking, and then the reality is I just don't have time to fill this out.
Hmm. Exactly. And like, let's even back up. Like, nowadays, there's whole cottage industry around security questionnaires, right? There's vendors popping up all over the place. There's platforms that are trying to expand into that vendor due diligence, that vendor vetting with, will automatically answer your vendor questions for you, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And they're popping up left and right, and some of them are really great. Some of them I kind of challenge a little bit, but as an MSP, we're seeing these things from cyber insurance. We're seeing these things from our own clients looking to add or replace tools. We're even looking at ourselves when we want to add or replace tools. And it's the Wild West. There is no standard. There is no, like, yeah, people say SOC 2 or ISO. I have my own opinions about that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. We say there's no standard. I don't know about you. The reports that I am most frequently asked for, or at least were, um, SOC 2. Some would ask me for ISO, but normally it was SOC 2. And this is even pre gradient, right? When I worked for an MSP, I would get asked
Yep.
for SOC 2, and my immediate response was, "We're not really a hosted software company like that. We do happen to have SOC 2, but are you familiar with scope and what you're actually asking for, or are you just kind of checking a box that we got
Box.
something?"
Right. And I think that's the actual key problem or challenge with the industry is that everybody is looking for the quick, easy button checkbox. And they're making the assumption that the SOC 2 or the ISO is that checkbox, right? Now, great. If a vendor has a SOC 2 or whatever, and you sign the NDA and you get the report, do you actually read it? Do you actually comprehend what's in the report? Do you even know what was scoped and, like, oh, all we're looking at is their financing or their business operations. We're not touching their
Right,
security. Like,
right.
so SOC 2 can be really great for the intent on which it's specifically scoped for, right? But it might not tell you the whole picture of what that vendor is or is not doing on due diligence and protecting themselves and you and your clients, right? So
And
the sad
and,
part
and we
is
should just,
that,
yeah,
go ahead, go ahead, Matt.
we should just clarify in case anyone's not familiar. The issue with SOC 2 that Tim is referencing is that when you undergo a SOC 2 audit, you get to pick what systems are audited. It's not your entire operation. So if you
Mhm.
have standing in the corner, this server you don't want anyone to look at because it's from 1998, you just leave that out of scope and it
Yep.
doesn't show up in the report as an issue. So just to level everyone, that's one of the key challenges with SOC 2 when you're reading them. Whatever they asked to be audited is what's audited, not the entire operation. There's nobody
And,
verifying that it's all in there.
and I would even take that a step further, and I'm probably going to catch heck for this on LinkedIn. I would say, like, the same is true for CMMC, right? A lot of what we see in the CMMC space is scope and boundary. What's in scope, what's in the boundary, right? And they may or may not scope it appropriately. I can't tell you how many times I've been, part of, evaluations or assessments against 800 171. And, there's two camps. It's everything in the company, at which point they quickly realize the costs associated and say, no, 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 wait a minute. This one human and this one computer, and that's it. But is that really it? Because is it only ever that one person and that one computer and that one process? Because 9 times out of 10, it's probably not. So
Yeah.
the scoping of any framework for that matter, any compliance, is really what's key when it comes down to vetting a vendor and doing your diligence with that vendor.
And since we're on the subject of scoping and SOC 2, one of the classic things you'll see in SaaS companies is something like this. Our application is hosted on AWS, which is a
Yep.
SOC 2 compliant data center. Therefore, we are SOC 2 compliant. And that's just not the case.
No, I am what you know about what we've done for the last 20 years. We've been following FedRAMP, we've been following NIST 800-53, which is the giant control catalog. Many other frameworks are based on 800-53. That is who and what we are. And so as a vendor, we always get do you have a SOC 2? And I say no, but we adhere to FedRAMP standards, and their eyes glaze over. So now I have to go down this conversation of, what is FedRAMP? What is SOC? What is ISO? What is HIPAA? Blah, 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 blah. And so I hate to say it this way. I feel like a vendor, we're being forced into obtaining a SOC 2, obtaining an ISO, because those are the questions that are being asked, even though they're not asking the right questions. What you really want to know is, how am I protecting your data? You know what? I'm encrypting the database. Like, the actual stuff in the actual database is encrypted. I can't get to it. Now, granted, through code and keys and all that fun stuff, whatever, but you steal the database, you got nothing but a gobbledygook of stuff because it's all encrypted. Now,
right.
Does a SOC 2 pull that information out? No. When I talk about, we hear this all the time, right? Supply chain, SBOM, right? We automated the whole software bill of materials. We analyze and scan our code before we do any production development. We remediate, like, we automated and we put in all the pieces and parts to make sure we're doing the best we can with the packages that we use. SOC 2 will never reveal that. SOC 2 will say, do you have a software development lifecycle? Yes or no? Yes, we do. Okay, check, move on. Nothing about what we're actually doing to protect. And I think that's the problem that I see with the MSPs and even the small businesses. Like, they're not asking the right questions. They're just looking for a quick and easy checkbox. Do you have a SOC 2? Great, move on.
And we don't mean to totally brag on SOC 2 here.
No.
It's the most common one and the one most people are familiar with, but many frameworks have these same issues. We're just using it as the point of reference.
Absolutely.
So the other point, in addition to scope, actually there's multiple other issues. I didn't even realize there were this many until we started talking. The next one that I would like to mention and talk about is, when reading it, the user entity controls section.
Yeah, absolutely.
I bet we have people who don't even know that exists because the SOC 2 report has never been read.
Yeah. We talk about it a little bit since I've been dominating here. Talk a little about it.
All good. So when you're reading your report that you got under your NDA and you went and actually opened the PDF, it's not in the the SOC 3 report, the one that's publicly available. It's in the SOC 2 section, and there's a section called I forget the exact title, complementary user controls or user entity controls. Someone can correct me in the comments on what the actual verbiage is. It's a section of conditions that need to be true from you, the user of the software, for all of the safeguards to actually apply and be effective. And so that's things like, if you are allowed to make your own user accounts, you're responsible for least privilege, right? And so if somebody goes in and makes everyone an admin, you can't go back later and say the software itself was insecure because you opened it up. Same thing with things like hosted infrastructure, right? Let's say you
Yeah.
have servers in AWS or in Azure or Google or wherever, and you open up RDP to them. That's an issue with the configuration and how it was set up, not in the platform itself.
Not
And
in the
so
platform.
there are going to be controls like this on every vendor, everything
Mm-hmm.
that you use, everything that you buy, everything that you read. And when you go to and start assigning the agreement, you are acknowledging that you've read these and are responsible for taking care of that portion of the
Yep.
environment's security.
Yep.
And I
So
would, yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, I was just going to say. So the adage of, "Oh, I'm hosted in AWS, so I'm SOC 2 because they're SOC 2," like doesn't fly, right? It's like, yeah, because you're still ultimately responsible for protecting and securing that environment. When you look at the IAM
Yes.
piece, the identity access management pieces, like I said, I'm going through SOC 2, I'm working through that. I'm working with my AWS engineer, and the first question he asked me was, who has access at what level, and let me look at, share your screen and talk about your identity access management in your AWS environment. It's the first question he asked, and I was like, well, okay, guy knows what he's talking about, number one. But number two, like, I could easily be like, oh, my developer needs something. I'm on the road. I can't help. Like, I'd like, here's admin access. Go deal with what you need to deal with. What? No change management. No, like, here you go. Like, and that happens a lot. We could talk about
Yeah.
all the breaches that we've seen across the internet for the last couple of years. It's stupid stuff like that.
No, that's a good point. Um,
You mentioned something a minute ago, as you were talking about the entity controls, right? And you said one of my favorite things, which is SOC 3, right? Nobody ever
yes.
talks about SOC 3, right? Nobody even talks about SOC 1, right? And I don't want to harp too much on the whole SOC versus Sarbanes Oxley SOX versus whatever, but you know the SOC 3. Like, I'm assuming you understand the three different levels of security operations, right? The SOC attestation, right?
Yes. Yes.
So to dumb it down a little bit, SOC 1, point in time in a scoped environment. Yay, we came in, we looked, we left. SOC 2, type 2, they look at your stuff over a period of time. I mean, there's more to it than that, don't get me wrong. They look at your stuff over a period of time, make sure you're doing your stuff. SOC 3 is the one that I always ask for, because that I don't need NDA for that, right? It
Yep.
is a publicly accessible report on where you stand. And a lot of frameworks don't actually do that. They might give you a little badge to put on your website, but to get to the details of stuff or whatever, that's why that's a benefit of the whole SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 is that here's a report. You want to go get it.
Yeah, it's nice.
So
Um, so no interaction required, no NDA. It's obviously not as complete, right? So you get
yeah,
kind of just a snapshot, but you find out quickly if this is a interaction or relationship you even want to go forward with, and then you can have a discussion and get the full report as needed. And it is needed. Don't just download the SOC 3 and call it good. Um,
right.
so the last section. So we talked about scope. We talked about complementary controls.
Yeah.
The last thing that I see skipped when reviewing these reports, and we'll talk about more than just reports. I just know audit reports are what first comes to mind when you think of
Mm-hmm.
vendor due diligence, is the exceptions, right? So
Yeah.
not everyone, I think, even knows that exceptions can be on SOC reports. You can
Yep.
certainly have controls on there that didn't pass at the time of audit. And that can be a lot of reasons. That can be during the sampling that was done during auditing. Maybe some
Yep.
change didn't go through change control. Maybe some thing happened. Maybe some vendor came on without full due diligence, or it can be something as small as a policy wasn't reviewed on time. And
Ooh.
the point of it is, right? The point of it is it can be anything, and depending on what you're using the software for and what it was, this can be nothing essentially all the way up to tanking the relationship and can't use it anymore.
Yeah, and
Um,
let's use that as an example, right? And how that would actually play out when I'm trying to vet a vendor, right? And so I'll pick on the survey thing again. This didn't actually happen, but
or survey vendor.
I'll use this as an example. It did not. I'll call it widget A because it wasn't the survey vendor. But we go through the process. We're now talking to sales engineers. We're talking to security engineers. We're in that flow of the conversation. And when I ask them for their exception report, and listed on their exception report is all their policy and procedure stuff. And I started to dig into that. Like, what's up with that? Because, me, policy guy, right? So I started to
Mhm.
dig into that. And they're like, oh, well, we just don't review it. What do you mean you don't review it? Like, uh, I mean, and it's not the vendor that I was talking about. This is something
Yeah,
completely
yeah.
different. I want to make that perfectly clear. So I'm not throwing somebody under the bus. But as I dug into the conversation, I realized, like, can I can you share your screen on like your account management policy? Well, we don't even have one. What do you mean you don't have an account management? How do people log in, and how are those like? How are your staff do it? Like, how are your like what? Yeah, policies and procedures with an exception. Do you have an SDL, a software development lifecycle document that talks about what you do? Oh, no, 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 we don't have that. What?
Ooh.
So the exception things are really something to key in on when, when you're doing your vendor vetting. Like, how are they, why is this an exception? First off, right? What are you either trying to hide or just don't have the info? It's one thing to say, you know what, we just don't have it. Oh, well, at least you're honest. I get that. Why don't you have it?
Yeah. And so if anyone is not familiar, when you're going through audits, there are different sampling methodologies to pick um,
Mhm.
changes or software commits or anything. And one of them is random, but that's really only one type of sampling methodology. There's numerous ways an auditor might pick. If you have, 5,000 changes over the course of the audit period, different ways that they might pick one. And most of the time, these exceptions are something like a change needed to happen that didn't go through formal change control, or
Mhm.
there was an emergency commit and they didn't go through the full review process. And if you happen to get one of those picked as the sample, you are not going to have the audit evidence that your policy says you're supposed to have.
Yep.
And that's okay most of the time. If I see that one change didn't go through change control, I'm probably not going to tank the vendor relationship based on that. It takes
Yep.
a little bit of experience to read the report and say, okay, this is something that's really not there that's supposed to be, or this sounds like something that just happened. And in any organization of any size, you are going to have times where policy wasn't followed, procedure was missed, extenuating circumstances, all of that. There's no the expectation of absolute perfection. That's just not realistic. And
Yeah.
so going through,
And,
right, you
and
read this report. Was it something that actually impacts the security of the environment, or was it real? And in fact, sometimes you're reading it, it makes me slightly more confident it's real.
mhm, mhm. And that even happened to us, right? So, agile team running, like, that happened to us with and it wasn't a security incident for us. It was, I hate to say it, people were taking our content and posting it all over the internet. And I was like, hold on a minute. What? Taking the
Yeah.
intellectual property and posting it on Reddit and all the places. And I was like, wait a minute, said to my developers, go turn that all off right now. Right. Change management. We threw change management out, right? Because I was like, I needed to stop this data. It wasn't a data leakage, right? It was, I hate to, what's the word? Thefts, whatever. It didn't really matter what the word is. It's,
Yeah.
I wanted to stop people from taking our intellectual property and just freely making it available on the internet, right? Because that's the core of what we do. And yeah, that didn't go through change management. I mean, Sure, it went through GitHub and it went through our CI/CD, but we didn't like we have a review process. You know, the developer does
Right.
the work. We have QA. We have this. None of that happened. I was like, go comment out those buttons right now and push it because this has now happened 4 times in the last 2 days. I'm tired of people taking our stuff. Right? It was a business decision to make an exception. We went back and fixed it and put a whole process in place to ensure that this doesn't happen. But I was like, oh my god, why is this stuff going up everywhere?
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, there are times when vendors like something affects our business and we need to step outside the lines once in a while, not always, to either protect our business or protect our clients.
Right. And if you're going through SOC 2, just Murphy's Law, that's going to be one of the changes that gets pulled for sampling, and you end up
Yep.
with an exception on the report.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, so we talk a lot. We talked a lot about SOC 2. We talked a lot about auditing, right? And so, I'd like to kind of share just our process. So for those that watch the replay after, I wish there were a few more comments coming in because we love some questions, right? And I want to see like where you think we could improve our MSP process or where you might see some holes in it, right? So
Mhm.
overall, identify, is there actually a business case? If there is, then we move on to who is the human, the people that's going to be the champion? What are the actual functionality requirements? What are the actual security requirements? Once we've come together internally on this is what we think we want, this is what we know we need, this is how we need to protect it, then we start vendor selection. We'll do things like G2. We'll do things like, reading online reviews, lots of Google searches. Some of those staff members might come to the champion and say another, hey, my buddy uses this, or hey, our partner uses that. So we will take all that stuff into consideration and narrow it down to our top 5 or 6 vendors, and then we'll start our diligence on, do they even have the functionality requirements, right? Um, Looking at their website, do they even talk about the security requirements? Once we've
Yeah.
kind of narrowed that down to our top, say, 3 to 5 vendors, and unfortunately, because of how the sales process works now, you end up in a sales pipeline going through to getting to that sales engineer or that security engineer to actually discuss the nuts and bolts. And what I do, like, yeah, I'll fill out the contact form. I get the email, let's book a meeting. Great. Or I booked a meeting, and my first response to them is, here's my Excel spreadsheet of our must-haves, nice-to-haves. Please respond with yes or no down the category. That's it. If most of them are no, thank you. Then we proceed into a deeper diligence conversation.
So you mentioned sales and security engineers, and security engineer brings up just a topic that I love to talk about when doing due diligence from both sides of this. And this isn't sufficient. This shouldn't be your due diligence. But if you can get on a conversation with the CISO, with somebody in the
Mm-hmm.
security
Mm-hmm.
department, and just
Yep.
talk about the approach to security. Now, just to be clear, this is not a replacement for due diligence, but what you can accomplish with things like this is to augment the audit report, right? So you don't necessarily
Yep.
have to send a 180 line questionnaire. You can get SOC 2 combined with this type of conversation and then feel
Right.
more confident you're getting a real idea of the security posture. And I liked that from the vendor side too. I would take meetings with anyone who wanted to
Absolutely.
have a security conversation. It was never a negative thing at all.
And as somebody in my, as an MSP, we've done that. Like, once I get past the initial sales gatekeeper and get either 5 minutes on the phone with them or set up an email with them, like, I would like to talk to somebody that knows about security in your company. Granted, the functionality, all that stuff, like the salespeople can, for the most part, answer that.
Yeah.
And even in fact, like I'm seeing more salespeople, SDR, BDRs, whatever, getting better educated on their products around security. So that's a plus for the industry. Like they might not have all the answers, but I see some of them that have some of the answers. And I'm like, wow, that's awesome. So, I think for us as MSPs looking at tools, like giving a little grace to the vendor, especially on the sales side, because they're doing the best that they can.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, of course.
but getting that security person, that information officer, that person at the company on the phone, I can accomplish more in a 20-minute conversation and address most of our concerns than it would be, here's my 68 point checklist, fill it out. If you don't get 100% on it, you're out.
Feels that way
You know?
sometimes. So let's talk about some things that we think in our experience that we've asked vendors for, and right, it's beyond just get your SOC 2 report, get your audit report. I'll talk about some of the ones I asked for as an MSP, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Tim, on both things that you may have asked from your perspective or good questions that people have asked you that are telling.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so a couple of the big ones, especially when looking at potential tools for me, were SSO support,
Yeah.
and for the MSP in particular was the ability to compartmentalize data. Right. So if I had
Mhm.
someone in the Rochester office, my home office, I wanted to be able to give that person access to only the Rochester clients. Same thing with the
Good
Dallas,
call.
all of those separations. And
Yeah.
that goes back to the idea of limiting blast radius if there's an incident,
Yeah.
right? If I
Yeah.
can have this tech who I assume his account is going to be compromised, when it is, it's the lowest amount of damage. Um,
Mhm.
Other big ones for us were the ability to integrate with our SIM, our log collection, audit data,
Yep.
actually having real audit data, not
Yep.
just the ability to send whatever you happen to have into the SIM, actually being able to dial down to a tech level who did what when.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, those
I
were
have a
some of the big ones. I'll let you answer
so
yours, Jens.
so we've spent a lot, last 40 some odd minutes talking about the security side of
Mm,
vendor vetting, right? And there's a whole nother bucket we haven't even touched on, and that's their business operations. That's their
yeah.
solvency. That's their corporate culture. That's their are you going bankrupt tomorrow and going to be out of business? Is your plan like M&A is happening everywhere? Everybody's getting bought out. Blah blah blah. Like it was actually refreshing. I had a prospect on the phone last night, and he started asking questions about our company, like where do you see yourselves in 5 years? What is your product roadmap? How are you dealing with feature requests? Right?
Oh,
How
that's
are
great.
you, yeah, how are you like, are you going to be around in 5 years, or is your goal to just get a bunch of cash in a couple of weeks and leave? Right. And
Mhm.
those are all like, none of those are security questions, right? None of that has to do with vetting your vendor on the security side. They're all business ops, rev ops, dev ops. Like, what is your sales cycle? And it was really refreshing to have an extremely mature MSP asking me these questions, because out of all the, dozens and triples or whatever conversations I've had over the last 2 years, nobody's asked me that stuff. And it's great
That's a
because
really good point.
it's great for us because I hate to say it, like we got our shit together when it comes to the security stuff, but like asking me about my corporate culture, like accountability, care, and trust, right? That's who we are. And nobody's asked me that question. They don't like, does your widget work and will it protect me? Yeah. And this is why and all, but is your company even going to be here in 5 years? SaaS providers pop up all the time. You know, they either disappear for whatever reason or they get gobbled up for whatever reason. But those are really I think, important questions to be asking vendors when you're looking at stuff. I mean, granted, nobody can be like Huntress, right? Like, the behemoths, the ConnectWise is the Huntress in the industry. However, those behemoths also deal with mergers and private equity, and that's a whole nother conversation. Like, the whole business side of the vendor relationship, I don't think anybody's asking that during the vetting process, except for that one person I talked to last night. I think it's a whole nother bucket of stuff.
That's a really good point. There, as an organization internally, there are a lot of questions to be asking yourself before even getting to the vendor due
Mhm.
diligence, right? We always talk about and focus strongly on security risk, but
Yeah.
there are, I think I've seen ranging anywhere from 8 to 10 categories of third party risk. And some of them are things like before you start working with a particular vendor, let's say you're working with something totally new and cutting edge, and they're the only player in the space doing that, and they go out of business one day. Now, what's the risk to your business if that just drops
Yeah.
out of thin air one day?
Yeah.
Same
Not,
thing
not
with
nothing like calling me out being
right.
in a category of one. Not going anywhere. We're going to be around for as long as the good Lord lets me be on this earth.
It is a good point though. So there are other things like operational and privacy risk. So, if
Yeah.
you're about to outsource something, what is the impact to your ability to deliver services if that vendor disappears? And that's not something
Mhm.
that comes up on a SOC audit or an ISO audit. That's an
Yeah.
internal thing that you need to think about, and you're taking on risk by going into going into business with a third party service provider.
And I struggle with that, right? So you mentioned outsourcing, right? So as a vendor, there's things that I outsource, there's things that I do internally, and I've been really struggling with, like, I need an assistant, somebody to help. I don't want to
Mhm.
use the term VA because I hate the word, but I need an executive assistant to help me. And everybody's like, hire somebody from, overseas, hire somebody from another country, hire somebody, like, they'll do it for $3 an hour. Like, and that's all the feedback I get. And I'm like, no. Number one, like, I want to support those in the United States because that's who we are at our core. But number two, like, I'm a compliance thing. I can't. I don't want to. It is not in my wheelhouse to, throw that offshore. And
Yeah.
even at the level of a virtual assistant booking meetings and making sure I'm on time and on track, even at that level of a detail, I struggle with as a vendor. Like, and there are other vendors that do that all day long, right? But from an MSP looking at our products, they're not asking that question. Do you offshore your development to, countries we're not supposed to talk about? Okay.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
It's a lot of trust,
yeah.
and maybe they don't have access to your full mailbox and just the calendar, but who knows? As a vendor, you might have something in your calendar like meet with private equity firm or fire, Tim, or
Yeah.
not you,
Yeah.
Tim, but fire employee
No, fire
tomorrow, right?
Tim.
Anything could be on
Fire
there.
Tim. Right. Well, even like, so the mechanics of a CRM, right? You know what that is, newsletters, all that fun stuff. Like, the do care that the difference of, like, oh my gosh, I hired somebody from Timbuktu for $2 an hour. I'm getting $2 an hour level work. And they just email blasted 6,000 people on my contact list the wrong thing. Oh, right. So
Yeah.
as a vendor, that whole outsourcing thing, it's hard. It's hard, right? And I'm not saying that one country has better. There's, like, humans in the United States can screw up too. Like, I'm just saying, like, it's a real challenge in the vendor space when it comes to wanting to do the right thing and weighing that versus the cost of doing the right thing.
So what's the best question you've ever been asked as a vendor beyond just the do you have your audit reports? Do you have your
It literally
security?
happened last night, as I was saying
Yeah,
earlier.
that's the best
You
one.
know, well, it hasn't happened a lot, but it was that conversation last night. Now, granted, it was 6 o'clock at night at this point, we're kind of just hanging out BSing and,
Yeah.
getting, like talking other stuff. And he, flat out asked me, like, what's your plan? Like, we've talked about other vendors that he uses in his stack that have been bought out and it is now affecting his business. And he flat out asked me, like, are you going to be here in 5 years? And I was like, that's a really good question. I have a 5 year business plan. I know what I'm doing between now and 5 years from now. And you know what? That shifts. So it could, like, so I'm now 7 months into my 5 year plan, which is now 5 years and 7 months.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Yeah.
always a moving target. It's not, in 2026, this is the date. No, it's, we're constantly evolving what we're doing and constantly shifting that date. And we do this in our MSP, right? So I'll sidebar for a second. You have 1 year agreements with your clients. You do a quarterly business review and you make a change to the environment and you re-sign a 1 year agreement. Now your 1 year agreement is actually a year and a quarter. And you do that quarter
Yeah.
after quarter after quarter. That 1 year agreement actually ends up being 3 to 5 years because you're reevaluating it every quarter. Where we reevaluate, I'm reevaluating our business plan at least every quarter, if not every 6 months, and adjusting that target date. So to answer your question, the one question, like, where do I plan to be in 5 years, was a great question, and that I actually had an answer for.
All right. So this kind of turned into an interview, which is totally fine. We didn't have a script or
I know.
anything. So I'm going to ask one more question so we can get out of here on time.
Sure.
And it's about Chuck, my new favorite
Oh, I
character.
love that. So have you ever watched the TV show Chuck?
Yes.
I
Yes.
love that. I love that. Anyways, we won't get into that. But you're the thing that you're like, you want to talk a little bit about it because I don't want to give it all away.
Okay. So yeah, so Chuck is a persona we introduced at IT Nation Secure, and Chuck is a very competent, experienced IT manager who keeps hearing about security, but isn't a security pro, right? He doesn't have the background, he doesn't have the certs or any of that. He's kind of learning to make that jump from technician. In this case, he's probably like the service manager or maybe even the owner who still works in the business. Um, and we've been following his journey along to how he figures out making that leap to security minded tech and engineer. So Tim, the question I'll ask you with regards to vendor vetting is say you're talking to Chuck, what's some advice you would give him to start making vendor vetting more effective for him? Right now, he's one of those guys that just asks for the SOC report. What should he start doing to move beyond that?
Build a process, define the requirements, and assign a human. Make it somebody's job to monitor, maintain, figure out, work through. Like, when nobody is responsible, nothing gets done. So probably the single most important thing that Chuck can do is assign a human champion, like assign a person to be the champion. And
Awesome.
that might just be Chuck.
It probably is, especially until his company gets bigger, but
Yeah.
making that a real thing that he does. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're about out of time, so we'll end it here and let everyone be punctual to their next meetings.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Tim,
Matt,
thanks for joining me.
It's been really great. I'd love to continue to do this again. I know we harped a lot on the SOC stuff. Don't want to like bash SOC 2, SOC 1, SOC 3, which just happened to be, par for the course. If anybody is interested in learning about our actual detailed process, reach out to Matt. He's on LinkedIn. I'm happy to jump on a conversation. Albeit, I'll speak for myself, whether a vendor wants to have a conversation, vendor to vendor or MSP to MSP, I'm always willing to chat on this. It's a subject that I really take a lot of compassion with, and it's hard, and it doesn't have to be.
All right. Well, thanks guys. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Matt.